Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you my round 8 game from the Vrsar Open. I have lost round 6 and 7, so you can watch those videos if you haven't. Those were pretty tough games. And in round 8 I'm facing Gricnik T, whom I faced before, the year before actually in Vrsar, and I had a completely winning endgame. Messed it up into a draw, so I wanted revenge. No, okay, Tine is a nice guy, I know him, and yeah, still, lower rated, I wanted to beat him. He played e4, c6, d4, d5, and we get the Panov. Now, against the Panov, I used to play in this position, bishop g4, going into the endgame. But I no longer do that. I dislike that endgame, and especially against a lower rated opponent, I don't want to risk an equal position, but also I don't want to risk a position that's simple to play for my opponent, that he can prepare for easily. So I play bishop e6, which is a very rare move. It's a new idea. It only became popular in the last 20 years. If you want to learn it, you can find it in the repertoire below on the Caro-Kann. But technically you're entering a Panov where you don't allow all the exchanges. I'll just briefly show you what the endgame looks like. So bishop g4 takes, queen b3, bishop f3, gf3, e6, queen b7, knight d4, bishop b5, knight b5, queen c6 check, king e7, queen takes b5, and then from here queen d7, a trade happens and you get a pawn, a simple endgame, excuse me, like this. And this I didn't want to risk. So I played bishop e6, and now we get the typical Panov plan for white, where they're trying to play b4, b5, and their queenside pawn majority. On the other hand, black has something akin to what happens in the Tarrasch, where in the Tarrasch, of course, d5 is the weakness. Here, d4 is the weakness, so g6. And there is only one way from here to play for white, which is bishop b5. That's the best move. If you try bishop g5, it no longer works like it does in the main line, bishop g5, bishop e6 Panov, because in that position on g6, black already takes on f6 and doubles the pawns and defends the d pawn. So here if bishop g5, bishop g7, black's just better. So bishop b5, my opponent did play it, bishop g7, and now knight e5 is the main move. You could also castle. Bishop d7, and from here bishop c6 is known and best. My opponent played a suboptimal variation, which allows black to equalize easily, in my opinion. Knight takes d7. And from here I can take with the knight, I can take with the queen. I have prepared this extensively, and I had concluded that taking with the queen is slightly more active, because in many positions you have queen f5 ideas, which you normally wouldn't have. Okay, both sides castle, rook e1, rook f e8, fairly normal, and h3. Now h3 prevents knight g4, but it's not about that. White would like to develop the bishop without losing the bishop. So white wants to go bishop f4 and, you know, have the h2 square if I play knight h5. But h3 is also a weakness. Okay, so I played a flexible move, rook a d8, freeing up my queen and my knight if I want to infiltrate. My opponent played bishop f4. And here I had the longest think of the game. This is where I no longer have easy moves to make. I can play a6, okay, chasing the bishop back to a4, doesn't change much. I can play queen f5, which is okay, but after knight e2, d4 is sufficiently defended, the bishop is defended, and I don't think I've achieved much. So I basically only had knight e4 and knight h5. If I go knight e4, which is the typical plan, this of course cannot be taken. If this is taken, then d4, and on rook e4 I can just take back on d4 with a slight edge, with bishop takes d4 of course, or even queen f5. So on knight e4, most likely knight e2 gets played, and, you know, e5 immediately, that seems kind of equal to me. e5, bishop e5, d5, rook e5. I wasn't sure about that position. So I had decided to play knight h5, and in this position I think bishop h2 is the main move, and the best move, but bishop e5 is also interesting. My opponent played bishop h2, and now I played the follow-up that I had decided to play before playing knight h5, which did seem risky to me, but I couldn't find another way to play for an advantage. So what do I have here? I can play a6 again, I can play bishop f6, doesn't really do anything. I cannot easily unpin my queen, so I played f5. And this is of course a very risky move. There's a clear downside to that move, and that downside is giving away the e5 square. However, I'm setting up a very dangerous threat here. If my opponent does not react to f5, I'm going to play f4, completely killing the bishop. And the reason the bishop is so easily disconnected from the rest of white's pieces is because the pawn is on h3, and you no longer have g3 as an option. So if my opponent doesn't react now, well, I'm going to be better. So I thought the only two sensible moves were bishop c6 and bishop e5. The only move that you're eventually going to play is bishop e5, so may as well play it now. And from this position, I had concluded that bishop e5, rook e5, e6 is good enough for an interesting game. I would of course say that white's better here, but I wouldn't say it's much better for white. b4, knight f6, you know, it's very complicated. Something like a4, I don't know, a6, bishop c6, bc6. It's complicated. White's better, but I couldn't see a clear way forward for white. For example, queen d3, rook b8, and you know, b4 is under fire. Now the engine of course says that white is +1, so f5 isn't a good move if it doesn't work. Fortunately for me, my opponent made a mistake playing a4. Now it does work, and now of course I can play f4. And even though the engine says equal here, to me this was a significant advantage for black. I had assumed that I had a massive advantage. It's equal, but it's equal because the engine plays very strange moves here to stay equal. So the engine says a5, a6, bishop a4, say queen c7 unpinning, and then it plays queen d3, and for some reason this is equal, because it takes on c6. I mean, you're down a piece. I'm going to play e5. I can play e5 now. e5, d5, rook e5. What do you do here? How is this equal? So okay, apparently it's equal. However, after f4, my opponent played b4. And now I wanted to clarify things on the queen side, so a6, bishop takes, b takes, queen d3, attacking my pawn on a6, but I can now play e5. And the pawn is immune, because if you take, then, you know, I can take on d4 at least. So if queen a6, ed4, something like knight e2, there's d3, so that doesn't really work. So on e5, d5 was played, rook e5, bishop e5, so still queen a6 hangs the knight, so my opponent played rook c1. Now I played queen g7, because, you know, you're still hanging the knight. And this position is still equal, which was very surprising, but if you play b5. And if you play b5, ab, bishop c3, rook c3, cb5, it should be equal, and the engine finds a way to bring this bishop out. However, my opponent played knight a2. And now I played rook a8 because I couldn't really find a way to save my pawn anymore. I couldn't find any decent tricks. I was looking at f3. However, f3 works. I had discarded it. So on bishop e5, queen e5, if you play queen f3, then there's queen b2, of course. So that's easy. If you play gf3, there is knight f4, and now you're dead lost, because I'm going to take on h3 and mate you. Queen f1 is the only move, and then rook e8. followed by knight e2 doesn't really work. I can also go knight e2 straight away. However, I didn't play f3. I played rook a8. My opponent played rook c2, and now I played the only, sensible move that increases the pressure on white's king. Of course, I played bishop d4. After bishop d4, g3 is completely unplayable, and more importantly, I'm threatening to win the queen with rook e8, rook e1. So the rook has vacated the first rank, and this is getting incredibly dangerous. My opponent played rook d2, and now I don't have to defend my bishop. I can go rook e8. If you take my bishop, I'm mating you. So queen d4, rook e1, game over. I couldn't suggest a decent move for white here. I don't really know what to do if you don't go rook e2. I think rook e2 is the only move to stay in the game, but it seems very, very ugly. So rook e2, queen e2, and now just queen e5. And I'm going to be up a piece in an endgame, and b4 is a weakness, and the knight is on the edge of the board, and the bishop is completely cut off. So I can understand why my opponent didn't do that. He played king f1. Unfortunately, king f1 is completely losing. It fails to a very simple tactic. Bishop takes c5. The knight on a2 is undefended, because the rook's going to have to defend mate. So if you take, I just go queen a1, rook d1 is the only move, and now queen a2. And of course, this is a massive material advantage. a4 is hanging, and I have a protected passed pawn, and my opponent's king is awful. So when bishop takes c5, my opponent did not take. He played rook c2. But now once again, I don't have to move the bishop. I don't have to give up the pawn on c6. I can threaten mate. Queen e7, also queen e5 would have worked. And I would have resigned here if I were white, but my opponent played on. Rook e2 only move to prevent mate. There's absolutely nothing else you can do. I don't know. What else? If you play rook c1, that doesn't work because of bishop d6. And after bishop d6, I'm just saving my bishop. You still cannot take on c6. And you're still getting mated. So he played rook e2. We exchanged everything. I saved my bishop. And after king d3, king f7, there was one line. If my opponent tries g3, I can play fg3, and on fg3 I can now play knight f6, and this pawn is pinned. I'm gonna go to e4, and that doesn't work. So he played king d3, I played king f7, f3, liberating the bishop, but now I'm just transferring my knight to the f5 square, and my king is too close to the center. The knight reaches f5. Now, if my opponent moves the bishop away, knight e3 wins the g2 pawn. He played king c3, king e5. He wants to play knight d3 check. I decided to allow that. I didn't want to go d4 here. I wasn't sure whether allowing the king into c4 was a good idea. So I waited for knight d3 and brought my king back. And then he made things very easy for me by playing knight c5. Of course, in this endgame, the bishop is completely hopeless against my knight because all of white's kingside pawns are on white squares. Suggesting an alternative is difficult, everything's losing. The engine says bishop a7, which doesn't do anything. Then I just go knight h4, forcing the knight back to e1. So knight c5. Yeah, of course I took. He took with the b pawn, and white's idea is to win this pawn and queen the a pawn. That really doesn't work. King e5, king b4, d4, king a5, king d5, king a6, king c5, and after a5 I'm in time to defend multiple different ways, but knight d6 is the cleanest. And now, of course, king a7 was played. I played king b5. If you play a6, I can win the pawn very simply, but I don't have to. I don't have to go, I don't know. Well, basically I don't have to do anything because the king cannot move without losing the pawn. So now just c5 and I'm queening. Therefore, my opponent did not play a6. He took the pawn on d4, and I took the pawn on a5, and that's it. bishop c5. I'm just gonna pick up all the kingside pawns. I took on g2, took on f3, and this was the only critical moment in this endgame where I think I'd messed up. I played knight g1 here, which isn't correct. I should have gone knight h2 check, and of course if king g5, then f3. Okay, I played knight g1. It's still winning. It's okay. He played h4. Now I can play h5 check with the same idea, h5, king g5, f3, but I decided to keep things simple with h6. He exchanged, the pawn is immune, so he played bishop c1, and I'll just c4. I'm queening my pawn. King takes, that doesn't work. I can play this, I can play f3, I can play c3. f3 now, bishop e3 has to prevent f2, so c3. Now the bishop is overworked, king g4, knight d4, the pawn is, the knight, excuse me, is immune. If bishop takes knight, I can go c2, forcing bishop e3, and then play f2. So here, bishop e3, f2, and one of the pawns is going to queen. So knight d4, my opponent played king f4, I played king c4, defending my knight. If bishop takes knight, king takes, king f3, king d3, and of course my opponent is losing. So he played king e4, I played c2, and he resigned. Now I'm just, gonna make two queens. The knight is still immune. If my opponent takes the knight, I just queen. So this wasn't a clean game. It definitely wasn't a clean game. But I think my idea to play f5 and to try and achieve f4 was the best trick I had. It wasn't really a trick, it was objectively a bad move because white's +1, but I couldn't find a way forward. Everything the engine suggests here makes no sense. For example, the best move according to the engine here is bishop h8 and knight g7. That hadn't occurred to me at all. Now that I see it, bishop h8 makes a lot of sense. Bishop f6 with the same idea, knight g7, knight f5, putting pressure on f4, or on d4, excuse me. But that's very, it hadn't even occurred to me. It's a very weird plan. I will remember it now, but this was the only way forward I could see. Unfortunately, with best play, white would have been better. So that was my round 8 game. I'm going to show you the final round tomorrow. Let me know what you think about the Panov, and again, the repertoire is below in the description. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.